Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're here for the project managers community group, and I'm going to turn it over to Heidi. Heidi, would you like to talk about what we're doing today?
I don't know. What if I don't? Um, anyway, sorry. I'm Heidi Banky. I'm the statewide project manager with Georgia Legal Services Program. I am presenting today with Christopher Cook from North Carolina, Legal Aid of North Carolina. I'll let him introduce himself in just a second. But today we're going to be talking about some basic foundations in project management methodology, which is agile versus waterfall. Um, Going into it a little bit more would defeat the purpose of the presentation, so I'm going to leave it there. And Chris, do you want to say hi?
Sure. Hi, I'm Chris Cook. I'm the head of the project management office for Legal Aid of North Carolina. Um, and yeah, we're here to talk about sort of an entry level what is agile versus waterfall and how does that become useful to you as a project manager. So we're going to see
Let's
if
go
it's going to
into it.
let me advance the
There we
slide. It
go.
is going to let me advance the slide. Okay. So we're going to talk about sort out of both of these methodologies at sort of a high level, but the key thing to take away, especially if you start looking into these on your own, is despite the way they are often presented, this is a toolkit. It's a box of different tools. It is not a religion. Um, the Agile folks do like to call their daily stand-up meetings ceremonies. It does always give me kind of a like gather round the chart and chant feeling. But you do not have to follow this like it's dogma. It isn't. It's a box of tools. People have been doing project management for as long as there have been people who need to do a thing. And a lot of these methodologies get reinvented every few years with some new branding as a way to reinterest people in particular ways of doing things. But you shouldn't ever feel like you have to do something a way that something is described. You're always going to need to right size either of these methods in order to make them work for what you're doing.
And I'll just add that this is not just us saying be more laissez-faire about it. The Project Management Institute, in their study materials for the project management professional certification, says not every project needs everything on the list. So even the people who are in charge of a lot of this stuff are like, no, you don't need all of it.
So let's start with waterfall. Waterfall is usually what is most familiar to most people. It's sort of the first logical way to approach a problem, which is it's got a beginning, middle, and an end. So let's plan the whole thing out and run through a beginning, middle, and an end. There is a right time to pick this. If you've ever seen the big Gantt charts where people lay out every step of a project and all of its dependencies and all the times that it's going to happen, like you can use a Gantt chart for anything, but the thing that looks most like is a waterfall method where you plan every step of what it is that you're trying to do from the beginning and then go. And it is very much a building a skyscraper method, and it works really well for anything where it's going to be like building a skyscraper. And what I mean by that is you have to build it up as you go, and each successive thing that you do depends entirely on what you did before. And so you have to lay that foundation, and then you have to put in the first floor. And there is a sequence in which some things must happen. So this is very focused on linear planning. It's very focused on needing to check in as each step is done because it's going to be really hard to go back once you've moved. And you can see we've got like the PMP version of what is the current state of how people describe waterfall there at the bottom. Like you're going to gather all of your requirements. This is just the big list of like how do we know we will have succeeded at the end? What's everything it has to do? What's everything that it needs? Then you bring all of that together into a design phase where how are we going to meet all of these needs? And then you build it, and then you test it, and then you invite everybody into your skyscraper.
All right. On the next slide, this is the more academic-y thing, but Chris did cover most of it already. you have to follow the specifics in a very specific order. This could be if you have a lot of people who need to confirm everything at the same time, or you can't do X until Y happens. You are also dealing with layered approval, which I think most of us probably deal with a lot, where you have to get, it's not just a decision that you as an individual project manager can make. You have to do, you have to report to people above you constantly to do that. We've had plenty of people talk about not being given the authority to oversee the projects that they're assigned to. So that's what I mean by that. Stakeholders integrated at pre-identified points in the project, and timely feedback is crucial. By that, I mean, if for some reason making a decision or granting approval to move forward doesn't happen, the entire project stalls, because everything is waiting on that one piece before anything else can happen and go forward. Also, when you're talking about stakeholders, if you have certain stakeholders that are only in level 1 of the project but don't need to be in level 2, usually they're brought in only for that point and then they're taken out, as opposed to Agile, which we'll show later, where you'll have them cycle through and you'll have different pieces there. Waterfall has very, very defined periods of when you need somebody and when you don't. And it's very rigid. In some cases, that is going to be a good thing, but in some cases, it is going to be something that creates a path that cannot be strayed from, which can get frustrating sometimes. Also, and this one is probably the most frustrating thing about Waterfall, and most project management certification programs dissuade people against Waterfall, but there is a purpose for it. But if you change anything in the scope, you have to go back and look at the entire project. The purpose of the process being so rigid is because you're going to go forward. But if you have like a 2 or 3 year project and then in year 2.5, something changes in the environment, which means you have to go and do something all over again, you're going all the way back to the beginning to fix that one thing. And I think that's about where we want to leave that. Any general questions about Waterfall yet? Hearing nothing, let's go for Agile.
Okay, so in keeping with my construction metaphor for the day, Agile is more like building a space station. If you're building a skyscraper, gravity matters. The build order really matters. You can cheat gravity a little bit, but you can only cheat it so much in terms of being able to build things in different orders. Agile is anytime you can do a build that is fully modular or mostly modular. This is why Agile is so popular with software development, is that it's often very easy to, I can build the component that does this process, and I can build the component that does this process, and they don't have to talk to each other until later. So you can build your whole thing in sections and assemble it as you go, and that's the primary use case for Agile is when you don't have a whole bunch of constraints, when you can just sort of go. And Agile is really good at taking the soup of a whole bunch of people being really excited to do a thing, but not necessarily knowing what the end looks like from the beginning, and turning that into something that is manageable and reportable, and keeps your scope from going completely bananas while staying flexible. So you're going to build it in sections. You can test everything separately, but it's very, very focused on this loop section that you can see that Heidi so kindly put together.
Heidi so kindly stole from something.
Heidi's the reason any of this looks good. But like the big hallmark of Agile is because it is so flexible, because it does these iterative loops. If you hear people talking about daily stand-up meetings, this is probably moving in there, and there are many ways to do Agile. I think Scrum is probably the popular one right now. They all of these different like branded ways to do this, they love to use their own language. But if what you're seeing is the build team every morning meets for like 15 minutes to talk about what are we doing, where are we stuck, what do we need to do, you're probably looking at Agile.
Okay. Next is, so as Chris said, we're looking at, we know where we want to go, but the way of getting there isn't necessarily as defined as it could be. Um, there are iterative sprints, which is what you're looking at in the image. You've got sprint one in yellow, sprint two in green, sprint N. So that would be three, but in blue. And the idea is you have broken down the entire project into the smallest possible work packages. So if my project is I'm going to, I don't know, serve 100 clients, then it would be you're breaking it down into each 100 clients. You have one client, and then you have even further down into that the intake, the service, all of those pieces. When you're talking about a work package, that's how small you're going to get. If you've ever seen a work breakdown structure, which I'm not expecting everybody here to have seen because that's really technical work, um, they are massive maps because they go that small. The work packages are the pieces that get assigned to the team. So if Chris and I were on opposite teams of something, we'd be assigned X number of work packages, possibly on completely different ends of something. And then we'd have to have stand-ups and report what we were doing and say how things are coming along. And then as our stuff got closer together, that's when we'd start integrating it. So those little packages dominate rather than the process of getting to the end. It is a streamlined approach. In that scenario where Chris and I are working on separate things, if one of us discovers that something isn't working or something needs to be modified, we modify the package. We modify and communicate what's going on with that small piece. And then the rest of the project can keep going um, after you calculate that modification. It doesn't have to go all the way back to square one like it would in Waterfall. It also allows for more engagement and more communication inward because you're looking at stakeholders in a completely different way. You are not just saying, okay, you're only in stage one. You are telling people you are the expert in this area. Hey, this is involving this area. Can we get your feedback here? And you have to keep notes in a way that all of your stakeholders can access. I think there is more communication generally in Waterfall. Um, so you've got that, and then constant review of best practices. Documentation. Agile cannot happen without documentation because things tend to move very, very quickly. Chris mentioned that IT tech people like it. Construction people also do like Agile. I know we just talked about Skyscraper, but it seems that tech and IT are the ones taking the most of it. Um, but it is essential to have effective communication and to know why decisions were being made at certain points because the process moves more quickly than any one person could keep up with in larger scale projects, especially. But that's what I've got on Agile. And yeah.
So now we've hit our like, why would you pick one over the other? And a lot of like this, the easiest way to think of it is they're sort of opposite ends of the same spectrum. Because if you noticed, they're a little bit doing the same thing arranged differently. So you want to focus on what does this tool set do for you and which way do you want to be leaning? Um, like we've talked about what they're good at, and a lot of it is how clear a picture of this project do you have at the beginning? Like that's a loose heuristic, but if you know for sure what this is going to look like, it probably is going to get waterfalled. So for example, if you have a project that you do so often that it's basically a workflow, you've a little bit transformed a thing you probably once did by Agile and moved it over into something that is effectively waterfall. And so that the level of certainty can affect why you might pick one over the other.
And then, of course,
But
the idea is you don't have to pick just one, but there are some other factors that go into this. Company culture. We've talked about this as a group before, but we haven't really dived into it or dove into it. I don't remember which one is which. Um, Regardless, there are some things, and I'm not going to read every single bit about your company that's going to make it more prone to be agile friendly or waterfall friendly. Control, competence, collaboration, and cultivation are different types of culture. Um, and I think some of it seems pretty obvious. Control is the more authoritarian. And I think it gets a lot of flack because it sounds kind of mean. But at the same time, the example I like to put is in the event of an emergency, if somebody is struggling to breathe, having one person jump in, point to somebody, and say, you call 911 is absolutely appropriate of the situation. And it is sometimes an absolute necessity. So every single one of these has a pro and a con. And we've tried to write that here in the presentation, and the slides will be available at the end. Um, it it's not a hard and fast rule, but the more control or the more you have impersonal actuality going on with the organization, the less they're going to be likely to want to do something that's more flowing or not set in stone. Do you have anything about organizations that you'd want to add?
In a lot of, so, in the way that the project methodology you should choose is the project methodology that people will actually use. This
Yes.
is, I think, the single biggest index of this. A lot of hay can be made about, well, this is best for this or this is best for that. In the end, people have to be willing to follow the process you've laid out, or you're right back to where you were without having any process at all, possibly worse off. And so some of this is like when we talk about getting buy-in, you're not just getting buy-in on a project, you're getting buy-in on how that project is going to be done. Um, I don't remember. Is this where we wanted to talk about the wonderful world of Dialpad?
I don't know. We can go into it.
Sure. So the example I had of like a project where we had to make a pretty conscious decision about what method we were going to use. Legal aid overwhelmingly uses some version of Agile. We've got lots of stakeholders. We've got lots of not just stakeholders, but we have lots of subject matter experts at the table. We have a very collaborative culture. We want everybody to, be involved and have a say. That lends itself really well to Agile. But last summer, we moved our phone system. And so we ported 1,500 phone numbers and 3 call centers and 34 offices from one calling platform to another. That is a huge lift. We had to do it in about a quarter of the time that our vendor thought we needed in order to do that. And so we wound up having to do a lot of messaging for people that even though normally we do everything very collaboratively, this was going to be a lift and shift. In order to do it quickly, we were going to clone what we had on the old system onto the new system. We were going to ignore all of our opportunities to engage in improvement because those would require a bunch of people to come together and make decisions. This had to move, which meant there was the number of people who could have a say was very small. We did collect some information at the outset, but this was very much a waterfall system. We did every movement we could plan up front. We planned up front, and then we shot it from a cannon, and there was one true path, and we followed it. But I will note, like when we talk about you're always gonna use a little of both. We did reach a point partway through where we were creating the big maps of how the call flows worked. And one of the call centers had a call flow that was just this massive spider web. And our CEO and the head of that unit sort of got together. And what they did is they showed up with a proposal. Like we'd done a good job messaging this has all got to be done in a particular way at a particular time. Changes are not really going to be a thing we can do. And we got a little lucky because like our CEO has a really good temperament for this sort of thing. Showed up as hey, I told you all to solve this problem for me, and you told me what it was going to take. I am asking you nonetheless, can you do this? Like, can you make this big change? As part of this, even though it's a deviation from what we all agreed on. And like we gamed that out and momentarily shifted over to some agile development to game through what a new version of the call flow would look like and ultimately implemented it. And it was very quick and it was extremely orderly. but it was very high control. There were 3 people who were allowed to make decisions. And most of them deferred to only one person who was allowed to make decisions. And that was because we had really tight constraints. We knew exactly what the end needed to look like. And trying to do the kind of collaborative, agile, iterative system would have destroyed the constraints that we needed to work under. But it was a tough sell. Like we ultimately got everybody on board, but it meant that we had to do, because that's not part of our normal company culture, we had to do a lot of upfront communicating about what we were doing and why we were doing it, and a reassurance that as soon as we get the rocket in the air, we can start looking at change. We can start taking advantage of all of the features we selected this platform for and switch over into a more collaborative, more agile style in order to do future development. But the changeover had to be run through Waterfall. Because if we picked anything else, we wouldn't have met the goals that we needed. But even in there, we had this little deviation where we took a bit of Agile and plugged it into the side of our waterfall. Yeah, we're
Yes, it's
still
always
doing
great if you have the
development. We are
change.
still doing development today. I've had 3 meetings this week about ongoing feature development for our call system.
It is a tangent, but any project, any effective project, regardless of methodology, needs to have sustainability in it. So making sure there's options to change later, smart. Let's go to the next one.
And
Oh,
quickly, part of the big load in, like when we talk about what is developing all of those requirements, is that was a requirement. If we're going to do this the fast way, we have to have a way to change things later. And so part of our planning methodology or not the methodology, but a big part of our planning for the waterfall path was making sure we weren't making decisions now that were going to mess us up later when we did switch over.
all right. I don't 100% remember which of these uh, either Chris or I were talking about. This was our brainstorming thing, but there are other factors that um, impact which project you're going to choose or which methodology you're going to lean toward. Um, Cost, obviously, if you're going to be doing 100 things at once and having a ton of people involved, it's going to change versus if you can only have 1 or 2 people involved at any time. Replicability, which is what Chris just referred to, not with the one project, with the idea of if you're doing it so frequently that it's basically a workflow. If it's going to be easily done or it's something that you've already done 100 times, you probably are going to lean more waterfall. The size of the team, if you only have 2 people, again, you've got um, less ability to be multitasking and to be keeping up 100 things at once because you have fewer people who can document and communicate and effectively take care of an agile project. And then time. Um, Mostly waterfall project, well, agile projects can happen faster. The problem is the planning time required for an agile project tends to be longer than it is for a waterfall project. But then once the agile project gets going, it catches up. Um, but that does require your team to be understanding of the fact that you're going to be in that planning stage for a lot longer. And the reason is because you have to break things down into work packages, try and figure out the system, figure out the communication, work out all these other pieces. Um, but like I said, it absolutely does catch up in the long run, and it is just as sustainable, if not more, in depending on the situation. Um, Anything else you'd want to add, Chris?
Mostly that, like, one of the things that, especially when you first get started, it can be very tempting to think of these tools mostly as how do I run a discrete project? And I want to encourage folks to think of them as a random box of tools that you can apply to all sorts of things, because in the end, kind of everything's a project in the way that, like back when I was litigating, I would frequently go to the trainings aimed at our social workers because I did have a sticky note on my monitor that reminded me I was not a social worker, but they have a bunch of tools and like how they interview people and how they interact with people that like I want to rummage through and steal for other stuff. So, for example, sprints are a big part of Agile. You queue up a bunch of work, you do that development loop as a sprint, and you have a defined set of stuff that you're working on. And one of the things that I have applied that to is the backlog of help desk tickets. Like we'll just get everybody together and I'll randomly like say, hey, we're doing a sprint for the next 2 weeks. I want everybody to clear as many of your help desk tickets as you can, and we'll check back in 2 weeks and see like, we'll have a little contest. Who can clear the most of their backlog? Is this a project? Kind of, but it is a container through which to explore an idea of getting things done that you can apply to a lot of different stuff. It doesn't have to be a formal project with a project charter and a phase gate check it and all of that. It like all of this is a collection of tools for how people accomplish things they want to accomplish. And a lot of them are widely applicable.
All right. You had the gravity point, and I don't remember your wording on it because it was so much better than what I could say.
Yeah, I don't know about that. So a big part of this in terms of like collaboration and communication requirements is to what extent does your project have gravity? Gravity in like this is harkening back to the like, are you building a space station or are you building a skyscraper? Sometimes the project you're working on doesn't have a lot of real world forces acting on it that create a correct order to do things in. But the more of that there is, the more you have these hard constraints that force a correct order of operations, the more you're going to lend towards waterfall. The other thing that I'd sort of separate out a little bit is when, at an intro level, when you talk about agile versus waterfall, typically people sort of use that as also a proxy for how much central control on the project is there versus how much freedom and collaboration there is. But you can run in the like big floofy agile exploratory loop system. You can still have a project that's running on agile that's very centrally controlled. And that changes how, like, what are your collaboration and communication requirements? In a lot of ways, waterfall front loads everything. You have to do all that planning at the beginning and then execute. And so I think people often frame this as agile requires more collaboration and communication, waterfall doesn't. The reality is, I think, no, they require roughly the same amount of communication and collaboration. It's, do you want to do it all at once or do you want to be able to check in as your project goes on? Because a big reason that Waterfall gets this reputation is not having a lot of communication is, well, you do it all up front, you then produce a giant chart of when everything needs to get done, and now I don't talk to people anymore. They ask me a question and I send them the chart. They
Right.
ask
I
me a
would,
question and I send them the chart.
just to make sure we're clear about it, because we've said similar things for both. Uh, the Agile is coming up with the system in which you will communicate as you're going. Versus Waterfall, you're coming up with, here's what the plan is. I'm going to let you know where I'm going with it, or if we've crossed the path.
And you've heard us say different versions of this over and over again, but it's very true. In the real world, I have I've been doing a lot of project management related stuff for a long time, and I've yet to see anybody actually use a pure form of either. There's always a little bit of you got your peanut butter in my chocolate, you got your chocolate in my peanut butter. We're all just making a Reese cup over here. Um, so with that in mind, pick the right tools. Like which components of which of these meet the situation you have. This is a especially when you get like a shiny new PMP, certified professional, especially if they don't have a lot of other work experience, they want to bring the whole playbook with them, and don't bring the whole playbook. Use the smallest amount of structure you need. You can always add more. It is difficult to take it away once it's moving.
But I want to play with all the things at the same time. Anyway,
I mean, to tell a story of like, it's important to learn from failure. One of the things that we started doing at Lance is we started trying to have every project have a project charter, and we'd never done it before. So we swiped a project charter, borrowed from another organization that was a lot larger and more complex than us. And so they had a like 12-page project charter. We cut it down to two, and it was still too big. It was still too much. It turned into an exercise in people filling out the form instead of engaging with the things that the form represented. And so we are in the process of re-engineering that and deciding which projects are going to need a formal project charter and which ones aren't. Um, and so like I'll never be afraid to muck around with the tool set that you've researched and make sure that it needs to meet your needs. You should never be meeting its needs.
and then just to reiterate in the chat, Shelley wrote, "Don't make it more complicated, more complex just to manage it. The project management technique should not get in the way of the project." Is the short way to say that.
And like we're as like a corollary to that, just to give a real world example, we're about to shift off of the tool set we were using for our internal project management, and we're looking really strongly at Jira right now. And one of the things that I have to keep telling myself over and over again is don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Just because I can track something at that level of granularity doesn't mean that like somebody other than me, either I have gifted myself a lot of extra work to keep up with all of this stuff that I have tried to put into the template, or I'm going to have to teach a bunch of other people to do that. And neither of that is good. What is the smallest amount of tracking I can get away with to make sure that I can tell what's happening in a project, and people know what the next thing they need to be doing is?
Tell me, Chris, how many times have you yelled at past Chris for making more work for you?
So look, past Chris is an idiot. I hate that guy all the time.
I think
You
that's our
wanted to
last.
talk a little bit about critical path. And I think that one's good in the context of, all right, but how much of this do you need to meet the need that you have?
So yeah, critical path methodology is a really strong, it's not a method in project management, it's a time estimate to help guide which things you're going to do in which way. It's essentially you take all of the different components of the project that are happening and you say this has to happen before this has to happen. This can only happen at the same time this is happening. This has to end at the same time as this ends. So there's a whole bunch of different ways you link the packages or the items that you're working on together. Critical path identifies the most efficient way to complete all of the tasks at the same time. So what you're looking at is you have to know for each activity how much time is estimated to complete each activity. So you can say, okay, this takes 3 days, this takes a week, this takes this much time. And based on that, you identify the quickest you can complete all of the tasks. You also identify if something is not going to be able to complete or if something falls behind, the impact that will have on you actually meeting it. If there's something that's kind of tangential and it doesn't really impact anything, you don't have to push as much. If it's something that's on the critical path of if I don't complete this on time, the whole project gets thrown off by a week, then you know you have to raise alarm bells. And that's, I think, the easiest way I can put it. We could probably do an entire presentation on critical path methodology. The one problem that I've run into, and I'm sure most of you have too, is that you have to know how to estimate the time it takes to complete each package. And without practice in project management, without familiarity in how your organization works or how different pieces move, getting that time estimate can be really difficult.
I've never worked on a project where we started at the beginning being very certain that we were going to use critical path and actually kept with it at the end. As I'm sure everybody, like anybody who's done a project will know, much like running a race, your form is your running form is real strong at the beginning, and then by the end it just all falls apart. Um, and that's my experience with use of tools for most of these. There's only been a few projects I've worked on over the years where we actually like really kept a strong use of methodology for project management through the whole thing. It starts out very strong, it starts to fall apart a little in the middle, and then by the end it's just sort of a mad scramble to get to the end. And there's I have decided for myself that sometimes you just have to embrace the chaos and accept that that's what's going to happen and plan at the beginning that that's going to happen at the end. Which I think takes us to the end of our slide deck. So
Yeah, I think so.
thoughts, comments, random stories, feedback,
We like
tomatoes, other
tangents. Those
rotten
are fun.
fruit.